Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're taking a look at the teasers that Creative Assembly just dropped for Total War Saga Troy. Slated for a Steam release next month after its one exclusive year on the Epic Games Store, it looks like the folks over at Creative Assembly are either completely abandoning the contentious truth behind the myth theme, or integrating a new mythological mode to play the game in. For many, this will be like a gift from Zeus. For others, it might feel like something else Zeus is known for. Let's take a look at these three teasers and what they all might mean. While the first teaser might have you thinking we're getting a bird-keeping DLC for the game, I think it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that we're looking at beasts from Greek mythology. From the nest of a griffin, the combination of the king of beasts and the king of birds, to the Hydra constellation, to the gatekeeping good boy Cerberus, we have an interesting trio here, and maybe even a mysterious fourth in this riddle format of the teasers. Maybe we've got a Sphinx. After all, the Sphinx does like its riddles. A Greek one though, not an Egyptian one. It is worth noting that while the Griffin is a generic beast, one of many, at least as far as my understanding goes, the Hydra is the Hydra. One specific Hydra that eventually is slain by Hercules, or Heracles if you will. Similarly, Cerberus is an individual, a specific three-headed dog. Even the Sphinx refers to a specific individual. So this begs the question, are we not only seeing a tease for mythological beasts here, but also perhaps a tease for how they'll be made available? Named mythological units alongside generic beasts of myth, perhaps? Like how the game already has Gorgons, but we could see the addition of Medusa, a named, specific, unique Gorgon. I don't want to belabor this point because we know literally nothing, but it is something to consider. Are we going to see generic and named variants similar to Regiments of Renown in Warhammer, perhaps? And if that's happening, are we going to see Regiments of Renown type treatment across the board for all units? Now I suspect, and this is all speculation, but I suspect that we're going to be seeing a rework alongside a piece of DLC here. The DLC will introduce new monster units like the Griffin, the Hydra, Cerberus, and the rework would change old units to their mythological versions, or give players the option to play in this myth mode where they'd be available instead, or final option, there would be Regiments of Renown versions available that were the actual beasts after which the units were named. So, while your Minotaurs would still be dudes in suits, their Regiments of Renown variant would be an actual Minotaur, meaning a faction can only have one or perhaps a few at a time. Again, I'm just using the term Regiments of Renown as a point of reference, not necessarily as a one-to-one adaptation. I doubt we'll just see the old units completely disappear and be replaced by the myths they were named after, because can you imagine completely changing the fabric of a game with an update a year after its original release? Not in a constructive way, but in a reductive way? Whether people would be upset about it or not, it's not a good precedent to set where a consumer can buy a game and then a year later, it's not the game they paid for. Can you imagine buying any other product and then a year later, it's not what you paid for? It just doesn't make any sense. Either way, whichever direction they go with, I imagine we're going to see the Cyclops be an actual Cyclops, the Minotaur be an actual Minotaur, the Harpies You get the picture. But with the Harpies and Griffin, we start to see a much bigger implication. One does not simply introduce flight into a strategy game without fundamentally changing how combat works. So what kind of new mechanics are we going to see for these flying beasts? Are they simply porting over Warhammer systems and mechanics, or are we likely to see an evolution which will in turn perhaps evolve further with Warhammer 3? Beyond flight, I imagine we'll see the old units get some adjustments if they are all being transformed into their mythological variants. They don't necessarily need new abilities or anything, considering we already saw things like, I don't know, Bull Rush and Savage Roar, or Boulder Toss and Blind Rage, but they might have some stats tweaked here or there, or we might see some added variants, Cyclops with great bows, or Cyclops with great weapons, etc., etc. I suspect the flavor text would need to be updated as well if the old units are just being replaced, and I imagine we'll be getting new events and decisions cropping up as well. If the DLC is focused on adding new units across the board, rather than simply adding a couple of new factions, I'll be curious to see just how much they do to make it worth whatever price tag they go with. This is definitely an interesting change in direction, and hey, if we're lucky, we'll see this thing get turned into a trilogy where they add Egypt and the Norse, and we'll have a full-fledged Age of Mythology Total War. Honestly, I don't really care about the whole Troy thing anymore at this point. Does it really even matter? If you're going to go myth, just go full myth. Give me my Age of Mythology Total War, please. I'm totally on board with that. Now, with that said, I had mentioned a few times during my brief coverage of Troy that the developers seemed to be of two very different minds in their execution. Personally, as excited as I am and would otherwise be for a mythology-inspired Total War game, I did like the idea of the truth behind the myth. I thought I had potential, and I was definitely in the minority there though, and it seems the devs saw the overall preference in the player base and have decided to fully lean into it. Overall, again, despite my personal interest in the idea of the truth behind the myth, this is clearly where Troy needed to go. Troy always had that fantastical angle to it. I've spoken at length about how some of the unit abilities feel plucked right out of Warhammer, and how they could have been implemented in more grounded ways to go along with the truth behind the myth idea, but instead, it just felt like a bit of a buzzword being used to maybe appease historical fans while actually building a rather fantastical game instead. I believe the developers were trying to strike a perfect balance, but unfortunately they ended up with something that had a bit of an identity crisis instead, and so it looks like that crisis is going to come to an end, and I am really excited for it. I felt this way throughout the early access period when I played Troy on the channel. I mentioned, the game is neither here nor there, and that caused sort of a bit of chaos, I guess, in the experience. And now, with a clear-cut direction, with a clear idea of what the game wants to be, with that opportunity to embrace that idea to the extreme, I think we might be in for a pretty wild ride. I'm curious to see where this goes. Now, with that said, again, I do hope we get a proper historical title soon, though. Saga titles felt like our last hope. It's been a long time since Attila, but that's a conversation for another time. Now, I'm curious, what units do you guys think we'll be seeing with this DLC? Do you suspect we'll see new factions being added too? Are we going to see, like, Poseidon versus Hades versus Zeus? Are we going that extreme? I mean, that'd be pretty cool, but I don't think so. I think this is going to be centered around units. But it can't be for just 3 new units, so what others might we expect to see coming out of Greek mythology? The Chimera? Dragons? Great lions and pigs of all sorts? I always like hearing, or I guess reading, people's speculations, and I'm quite curious to see just how far this rework and DLC will push things, and beyond that, what's next? If this DLC sticks its landing and changes overall opinion and sort of thoughts on Troy, we might see some pretty exciting DLC coming up for Troy afterwards, and what does that mean for Total War as a whole, right? I will find it funny, though, if it all turns out to be an update about actually, bird keeping or hunting animals or something, but that seems very unlikely. So there you have it. We see Total War's first full foray into mythological units on an otherwise historical battlefield. Well, historical with air quotes. Let's see how it turns out. To keep up with more strategy gaming news, reviews, previews, and more, don't hesitate to subscribe to this channel. And as always, a massive thanks goes out to all of my channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. You keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.